I'm Eileen Siffermann, and we're going to begin the next presentation right away. They don't allow any time between presentations, so that's why we're talking quickly and moving along fast. So will my slides go up? Yes? No? Okay, I'll start. Oh, I'm going to report on a study that was done at Northern Illinois. Oh, thank you. A study that was done at Northern Illinois University by Penrod, Bergen, Weiner, Blosh, Bruce is right here, and myself. And this was taken. Now I should have had you give me lessons to see what button I push here. The arrow? Oh, this one? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So in 1983, there was a report that was done by Usler, Hill, and Peck. And I don't know if some of you might know the name of Butch Hill, who worked on this. And this was done in 1983. And they were providing information on 11 goals, the original 11 goals. I'll go over them in a minute. And tied to those goals were certain competencies. So we looked at that data that was presented in this publication by the American Foundation for the Blind. And in 2019, we decided to duplicate the questionnaire and to duplicate the research, and so that we could do a comparison. So in 2019, we sent out a questionnaire which had the 11 original goals and the 164 competence. I'm not going to go through all the competencies. I have a list of them if you really are that interested in it, but we'll talk a little bit about some of them. Now, the original competencies came from this publication. I should move it forward. Too far. Competencies came from the publication, and the reports on the goals and the competencies identified for the profession of orientation mobility specialists, for the professionals. And what happened at this time was these competencies then grew into be the standards that we have for accreditation of our O&M programs, and also for the blueprint for our O&M certification exam, because in the year 2000, we required to have an examination, where a sit-down examination for certification. So in all kinds of situations, you have to have a periodic review is needed for such competencies, both for the academic competencies at the higher education program, as well as for certification. Our certification exam has gone through 5 revisions. That's how often we revised it since 2000. So these are the goal areas. Body image, orientation mobility techniques, assessment, instructional methods and strategies, sensory motor functioning, psychosocial aspects, human growth and development, systems of orientation and mobility, history, philosophy, and profession of orientation, O&M, and program development, administration, and supervision of O&M, and professional information. Now, to give you an example, what type of competencies are in these goals, because of themselves, they aren't that descriptive. They're pretty descriptive, but not totally. So it would be like the identification of important objects and measurement concepts. Most of the concepts that we teach within orientation mobility. O&M techniques, human guide, protective techniques, familiarization, public conveyor systems, and cane techniques in that goal. Assessment, observation techniques, administer, analysis, and interpretation and writing assessment reports. Instructional methods and strategy, individualization of lessons, teaching the use of perpendicular and parallel alignment with the traffic. These are just a few samples out of the 164. So don't, there are things that I didn't select to put in this section as just a sample. Sensory motor functioning, the conditions of the eye, a prognosis of visual impairment, and an effect on visual functioning. So not only the medical aspects of it, but also the functioning aspects of vision. Under psychological aspects, counseling students and setting mobility goals, choice of mobility systems, human growth and development, understanding the effects of additional disabilities on O&M, process of learning with visual impairment, systems of O&M, the long cane, dog guide, electronic travel aid, electronic orientation aids, under history, philosophy, and the profession of O&M, low vision services, advocacy for persons with a visual impairment, code of ethics, and certification standards. Under professional development, administrative and supervision of O&M, development of appropriate goals and objectives for O&M programs. And under professional information, professional responsibilities for ongoing familiarity with the current professional literature pertaining to O&M. So those are the goal areas. So in the comparative study, there were great numbers of similarities between the study that was done in 2019 and the study that was done in 1983. And what that told us was that it assured us that the initial competencies and areas or the scope of practice within O&M was still being supported. Little bit of differences, which I'll tell you about, but there was a high correlation between the 2019 and the 1983. So as you can see here, for body imagery, we ranked them through 1 through 11. So this is what the number before the percentage is. So in 2019, the body image, it was 4th on the list of the 11th, where in 1983, it was 6. And you can understand where that could come because we moved a lot from 1983. By the 2019, we were working with a lot younger children. So you can see where the body image skills became more important. O&M techniques, where it was 2nd and 83, it was 3rd, close. And you can see the correlations, they're only a point apart. So they were really, really similar. So that was still high. Assessment in 1983 was 1st, and in 2019 was 5th. But again, it's only a point apart, but they did drop. And instructional methods was 10, went down to 10 in 2019, and it was 8th. And I think that it still had a high importance and very similar, but because the other goal areas sort of rose up because of other conditions, this one looks like it went down, but percentage-wise, it's comparable one year to the other. Okay, sensory motor went down to 7. It was at the 5th position before. And the percentage is higher. All the percentages went up. Every area became more important. no area became less important. So one of the things we always, because of Bill Weiner and I working and doing the chapter on the history of the profession of orientation and mobility, history always comes in last. Nobody's interested in the history of O&M, but with this new study, it got a higher percentage point. So that made us happy in looking at that. And part of it was, I think, the emphasis that happened with certification programs. So those are the comparative studies. So the result, just generally speaking, the importance, let me move it. The importance of each goal area has been upheld. The order of ranking changed. 5 areas have moved up, 4 areas moved down, and 2 areas remain the same. Okay, in this next chart, this is one of Bill Weiner's designs that I put into it. So it sort of tells you where the movement happened with his arrows of those going down and those going up. But the summary sort of gives you a better idea overall. But, and I'll I mentioned some of the significant, where the significance are. Okay. I don't need to go through that. Okay, so the conclusions regarding the competencies. Okay, from 1983 to 2019, there is a consistency of agreement regarding the importance of the goal areas, with each having greater support in 2019. 2 have grown by 7+ % in importance. And they have the systems of O&M and the history and philosophy of the profession of O&M. 3 have grown by 4+ % in importance, and that's concept development, body imagery and spatial skills, a program development and administration, and professional information. Now, within the 2019 study, we also looked at the competencies, and the competencies were also done in the 1983 study, but we didn't have the results from those competencies to make a comparison. So what I'm going to go through is to sort of take the top 10 out of the 164 competencies and the bottom 10 to show you that level and figure out the ones in the middle. So the top 10 competencies, which were ranked from 100 to 99.3, pretty top. Appropriate procedures for assessment of O&M tech. And within the United States, every student is required to have an assessment before they're are recommended for O&M services. Adaptation and individualization. We now do individualized plans for each student, each client, adults, as well as the student, the young ones. We teach both perpendicular and parallel alignment with traffic. That is a high percentage point, and you can see where the importance of that is, especially for O&Ms who are teaching out in the community, that lining up for crossing streets and familiar with the intersections is important. Street crossing, and then leads into street crossing. Ascending stairs, descending stairs, administer of O&M assessments, analysis, interpretations, and reporting assessment information, recovery, and route planning. Those were our 10 top competencies. Now, the bottom ones. And this was 86.8 to 64.1. The history of the long cane. I guess the new generation is into as much history as one would hope. History of ETAs, electronic travel aids, and electronic orientation aids. Develop and scheduling to utilize O&M instructors' activities. Developing of a personal philosophy of O&M. The accreditation process for agencies and schools. Nonverbal gestures, facial expressions. Non-optical aids for near vision. History and philosophy of the education and rehabilitation practices that affect O&M services. Major historical events leading to the establishment of university programs in O&M. And manual communication. So when the new volume of the Red Book comes out, the chapter that Bill and I wrote, Bruce, just really will probably not be read. Kim, you'll have them read it in your course though, won't you? They'll have to read it, yeah. So it took, now I did it. Now I can't get, oh yes, it's back. Discussion. So in looking at all this data, we came up with some discussion points. I identified competencies appropriate in 1983, described a core curriculum of O&M services to individuals who are totally blind and have no other handicapping conditions. So we were really not looking at the multi-handicap or the severely multi-handicap in that study in 83. However, in the 21st century, O&M services are being provided to an additional population of blind and visually impaired. We're working a lot more with multi-handicap students, with CVI, a physically handicapped wheelchair. And so we have a lot more students that we're working with. O&M services to individuals who are deafblind require that the O&M specialist be knowledgeable in the area of nonverbal communication and the use of interpreter for communications. So what the standard is within the United States is that you have an interpreter go out with you on your O&M lessons, and that you are not the interpreter. You could have that certification or meet that qualification, but most O&M specialists don't have that qualification. And competencies are needed to provide quality O&M to individuals who are blind and visually impaired, who have cognitive and behavioral disabilities. So these competencies didn't address that cognitive issue and the behavioral issue. And we all know, as we're teaching now, that those are competencies we have to work with the populations that are out there. O&M specialists serve infants through older adults. The competencies are needed for those populations as well. When I got into the field, you only worked with juniors or seniors in high school because that was where the issue was. And then I started working with the kindergartners, and they were like, what are you doing working with kindergartners? Now people are out there working with infants, which is wonderful that we've expanded that, but we haven't really identified competencies for working with those populations. So further research is needed to identify subset of competencies that apply to those individuals. And then the use of assisted technology, which let's hear GIS and GPS, to ensure the appropriate O&M services are provided. So how's my time? So see, I gave you a hard time, but I didn't look for myself. So there's a lot more that we need to do with developing those competencies. And when they're developing the O&M exam, they're looking at so many issues right now, they really have to, how do you address all of that? And we sometimes talk about having subspecialties, like you have the general O&M competencies met, but then you are also have the competencies for working with early childhood development or early education, as we call it. Or if on the other end, working with geriatric. So those would be specialized competencies that we would go back through in service and achieve those competencies. So, Bruce, do you have any comment? Bruce will work on the, Bruce was part of the group that came together to do the analysis, but he didn't want to present with me. So I'm giving him the opportunity now to speak. You can speak, sir. Do you have any comment about the research project?
Thank you. In another section that will be published shortly, there were 3 questions asked. The first question was, have you taught people who are not visually impaired? So like mentally deficient, wheelchair users and so on. And it came out that 33% of the mobility specialists were working with people with other disabilities. And I think that was, one of the key things there that, was of interest to me and, in some of the future programs. And I think sometimes, I think every country seems to be short of mobility specialists. And one of my thoughts was, if people started getting a mobility specialist who was working with all disabilities, a school system or a small area could afford the mobility specialist, because they wouldn't be working with the 2 or 3 or 5 blind people. They would be working with 30 or 40. And, as an aside, many times with a mentally retarded individual, you can get success in like 2 weeks because they know all the information when it's safe to cross and so on. But no one's ever allowed them to implement the decision. So it's a whole thing about just giving them practice to work out things and implement the decision. But that's just a small example. But that was one part of, the survey that, we tried to break it down.
And that was additional questions to the initial study that was done in '83. I mean, those questions were not asked in '83, but we added those to the survey in 2019 to get some more data information along with a few other areas. And we refer to it as travel training in the United States. And there is a whole group of people that do travel training. They do not work with the blind and visually impaired. Within their definition, they say they do not work with they say they do not work with the blind and visually impaired. So
have you ever discussed or planned to change the distortion of manpower? There are mobility instructors, from what I have learned, 90% of them work with children and 10% with the geriatrics. Oppose the numbers are with the geriatrics, not with the children. So there are very few mobility instructors that allocate their time to work with the elderly.
that's right.
So what is to be, something must be done.
Well, there is a discussion in the United States currently where a lot of people are opposing it. And we don't know the details of it yet, but they were looking at maybe providing additional training to our occupational therapists who will only work with elderly blind. And most of those people are newly elderly blind. I mean, they were had normal vision, but as they, especially that our population is aging, that, you know, that blind people, that people are living longer, so they end up with a visual impairment. But there's a lot of opposition to that, so we'll have to see where that goes. But that was one of the ideas. It's only an idea right now. We don't know exactly what the proposal is. But one of the interesting things, when we entered the profession in the 60s and early 70s, there were few of us, but the need was not there. But we did such a wonderful job, and we have provided such great service that now everybody's saying we need more O&M. You know, there's a shortage. Well, I think what has happened is that the service has become more valued by those who are blind and visually impaired, that they want that service for them. When they saw what we did with the younger people, younger population through the rehab program, people saw what we did with the little ones, and now they're saying, well, why can't the elderly have that? And they're right. Everybody, I think, is entitled to those services. So consequently, we have identified or created a shortage by having our service valued. So, because when we started there weren't that many O&M specialists. The programs had started in the early 60s, and, you know, they just didn't produce them that fast. But the need has gone to be greater. Any other questions? I have a minute.
Now in the USA, are there any programs for O&M instructors?
Yes, we have revitalized our approval program for our O&M programs. And now they're called accreditation programs, and we have 19 accreditation programs. And if you go on the AER website, aerbvi.org, you can get a list of all the university programs. Yeah, as well as if you go to US OMSA, there's also a listing of all the programs. I haven't counted them lately, but not all of them are accredited. So I imagine there's about 24 or 25 programs. And some and it all depends on funding. So some funding. So some of them pop up and then some of them don't have stabilized funding. Kim, would you know exactly how many number we have? Would you say around 25? Yeah. Yeah.
The last question for me, have you studied or maybe thought about it? What about the training of refugees? Because we have many in Greece now, and we have refugees that come visually impaired, and maybe the instructors should have some more competencies apart from the language, because most of the times we don't speak their language, we don't have interpreters.
Yeah.
Have you thought about it?
Yeah, I don't think that we've really addressed that too much. I know that I'm in Arizona and lots of Spanish speaking people. And then we have our Indian population with Navajo and Apache, which is all the different languages. But we try to do more diversity, you know, like there are not too many African Americans within, or Black people within the orientation mobility community. And the universities work really hard with trying to bring in a diversified population. But you have to also realize that for the young people, they have a lot more opportunity now. I mean, my grandnieces and nieces are going to school in engineering. That was unheard of years ago, that a woman would have her degree in engineering. But those are higher paid salaries. Okay, I could take one more question. Okay, in the back.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you think this 11 goal areas and their sub areas are competencies
Yeah,
are sufficient for all the new skills that O&M instructor need to know. We
No.
talked about CBI, refugees,
Yeah.
technology,
Yeah.
new knowledge about the neuropsychological development
Right.
and the brain development and so on. Do we need a number 12?
we know we need to have subsets. We need to have, as I mentioned in the presentation, we need to have subset of competencies for early childhood development. We need to have a subset of competencies for deaf-blind. We need a subset of competencies for geriatrics. It's very different when you're working with somebody who is 90, who's lost their vision, than the population of a senior in high school. So yeah, we need to really work on that.
Thank you.